Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true horror stories for sleep that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. The Stalker's Call by Taylor Parker. It was the summer of 2007 when everything changed for our family. At first, it seemed like something small, something I could laugh off. You know, the kind of thing that happens when you live in a small town. Someone prank calling or dialing the wrong number. But I'm telling you, that night, the first call, that was when everything shifted. I never could have imagined what was about to happen. It started with a ring, just a regular ring in the middle of the night. At least, that's how it felt at first. You get a call at 3 a.m. You're not exactly expecting the world to change. At first, I thought it was one of my buddies messing around, maybe drunk and dialing. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me to, so I did. The voice on the other end wasn't normal. It wasn't even like a regular prank call. The sound of static, mixed with some kind of distortion, made my skin prickle. I couldn't make out the words at first, but there was something unsettling about the way the voice dragged through each syllable. Then it said my name. "Hey Parker, I see you." My heart sank. The voice wasn't familiar, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was just a fluke. I remember laughing nervously and asking, "Who is this?" But the voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it began listing off things. Personal things. Things it couldn't possibly know. You're wearing the red t-shirt you always wear when you're around the house. You're sitting on the couch in the living room. Your mom's in the kitchen, and your dad's reading in his chair. I see the way your dog's lying next to you, and how the TV is showing some late-night infomercial. How long has that TV been on, Parker? I froze. I didn't know what to say. The hairs on my neck were standing up now. This wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. I could hear my mom shuffling in the kitchen behind me, probably getting a glass of water. Was she listening to this too? My heart was racing. I tried to hang up, but something held me back. I couldn't stop myself from listening. The voice continued, casually listing even more details. My dad's slippers, the clock on the wall that always made a ticking noise. And then, it said something that made me drop the phone. "I'll kill you, Parker. You and your family. You won't even see me coming. I swear." I felt the blood drain from my face. I slammed the phone down on the table, my hands shaking. My mom and dad came rushing into the living room. I could hardly speak, but I managed to tell them what had happened. They thought I was overreacting at first, but when they heard the voicemail, their faces turned pale too. We listened to the same distorted voice saying the same terrifying things. And the details, the way it described everything in the room, there was no way anyone could have known that. We called the police right away, thinking it was some sick joke, but nothing could have prepared us for what came next. The police arrived around an hour later, just after the call ended, but there was nothing they could do. They tried tracing the call, but the number was blocked. The dispatcher told us not to worry too much, that it was probably just a random prank, and to let them know if it happened again. My mom wasn't convinced. Neither was I. The next few days were strange. I tried to go back to normal, even though it felt impossible. I kept my phone by my side, never letting it out of reach. The idea that someone had just watched our house, had somehow known the details of our lives, left me feeling exposed. Like a target. The police had done their part, but they hadn't caught the person. They said they were still investigating, but the truth was the calls had stopped. Or so we thought. Then came the second call. This time, it came earlier in the evening. It was a Wednesday, and I was sitting in my room, just scrolling through my phone when it rang again. I didn't even want to pick it up. I almost didn't, but I felt this horrible pull to it, like I had no choice. Maybe I was hoping that this time, it would be someone else. Maybe it was the cops calling back, telling me they'd caught whoever it was. But no, it was the same distorted voice. "I know what you're doing, Parker. I know you're talking to your friends. You're sitting in your room with the light on, playing with your phone. Your mom's in the kitchen, making dinner, just like last time. Your dad's sitting in his recliner, reading the same book he was reading 2 nights ago. The voice chuckled, low and mocking. I can see you. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't even move. I thought about hanging up, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to. What if this was the last time I heard from this person? I needed answers. And that's when the voice said something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Did you hear that, Parker? Your dad's getting up. He's walking to the front door. He's going to check the mail. And when he opens that door, he's going to die. I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding in my throat. My first instinct was to run downstairs, to stop my dad from opening that door, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, listening to the voice. It seemed to know everything. And then, the voice went silent for a few seconds, long enough to make me think maybe it had ended. Maybe it was over. But then I heard a faint click, the sound of my dad's boots on the hardwood floor. It was almost as if the voice could hear exactly what was happening in the house. I grabbed the phone, terrified to hang up, terrified to hear what came next. You're not fast enough, Parker, the voice said. He's already there. I rushed down the stairs as quickly as I could, feeling the weight of each second. When I reached the front door, I saw my dad standing outside, holding the mailbox in one hand, the other hand frozen on the door handle. Dad, what are you doing? Get inside, I shouted, running to him. He turned to me confused. What's going on, son? Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. A gust of wind so strong that it knocked us both off our feet pushed against the house. My heart pounded in my chest. There was no way we had just heard that voice. It couldn't be real. There was no way anyone could know this much. We went inside and checked every window, locked every door, but the dread never left. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, waiting for the next call, the next horrible voice on the other end of the line. And it came, but it wasn't just one call this time. There were 2. The first came early in the morning, just as the sun was barely starting to rise. It was a different voice, but just as distorted, just as unsettling. The voice called me by name, just like the first one had. And the second? It was the worst of all. It was a voice I recognized. It was my dad's. It wasn't a recording, though. It was real. I could hear him on the other side of the line, mumbling in a low, groggy voice, just like he did when he first woke up. Parker, you have to stop looking for me. I'm not here. The line went dead. I bolted out of bed and ran downstairs, fearing the worst. I found my mom sitting in the kitchen, pale and shaking. I heard it, Parker, she whispered, her voice trembling. I heard him too. I could feel the panic rising in me. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was my dad even still alive? Was he really in the kitchen? Or was this some trick, some twisted game the caller was playing with me? I tried calling my dad's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again and again. The same message. No answer. I ran to the garage and saw his car was gone. My dad was missing. I could barely breathe. My mom's voice was shaking, her hands trembling as she clutched the kitchen counter, trying to steady herself. What if? She started, then stopped, too afraid to even say the words out loud. What if Dad wasn't coming back? What if the calls, the strange things we had been hearing, weren't just a sick joke? We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, each of us processing the new nightmare that had unfolded in front of us. My mom and I both looked at the phone. It was in my hand, still showing the last missed call. I couldn't even look at it anymore. It felt like it was watching me. I'm going to find him, I said finally, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound brave. I ran to the door, my mom calling after me, begging me to be careful, not to go outside alone, but I couldn't just sit there. My mind was racing. I had to find out if my dad was okay. The voice, the distorted voice on the phone, it had felt so real. It was as if it knew us, knew every detail of our lives, even our most intimate moments. There was no way a prankster could have pulled off something like that. No way it was a random person. As soon as I stepped outside, the air hit me like a cold slap to the face. It was early, the sun just beginning to rise, but there was something off about the quiet. No birds, no sounds of cars, just an eerie stillness hanging in the air. The only movement was the occasional flicker of the trees in the distance, swaying slightly, as if disturbed by something unseen. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I pulled it out, only to see the name Dad flashing across the screen. My heart skipped a beat. I was about to answer when it went to voicemail. My stomach twisted into knots. I checked the time. It was a few minutes after the call had come in. I tried calling him back. Ring, ring, ring. Nothing. I ran down the driveway, looking up and down the street. The quiet, peaceful suburban neighborhood I had grown up in now seemed like a maze of unfamiliar shadows. The houses, which had once seemed so cozy, were now looming, watching. There was no sign of my dad, no sign of his car, nothing that suggested he'd been around recently. I turned back toward the house, my mind racing. Where could he be? How could he have just vanished so quickly? Just as I was about to go back inside, my phone rang again. I checked the screen. This time it wasn't a call from Dad. It was an unknown number. My heart sank as I answered it. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking. Silence. Then a voice, low, distorted, familiar, crackled through the phone. "I told you, Parker," it whispered. "He's gone." I froze. My entire body went cold, a chill creeping up my spine. The voice was so familiar. It sounded like my dad, but not. It was different. There was something off about it. Something wasn't right. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The voice chuckled softly. It was the most bone-chilling sound I had ever heard. "I just want you to listen." Then, for the first time, the voice changed, and what it said next felt like a punch to the gut. "You didn't listen, Parker. You should have stopped searching. Now your dad's gone. It's your fault." The line went dead. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the ground with a soft thud. I stood there, frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. What had just happened? How could they have known? How could they have done that? I rushed back inside, my heart racing. My mom was sitting on the couch now, her hands pressed to her face, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "Parker, what's happening?" she whispered. "Where's your dad?" "I don't know," I said, the words barely coming out. "I don't know where he is." There was another pause, and then it happened. The front door opened. We both turned toward it, our breath catching in our throats. The door creaked as it swung open slowly, revealing nothing. Just a quiet, empty space outside. I moved cautiously toward the door, my mom following me, and looked around. There were no signs of anyone being there, no sign of Dad coming back. But then, my gaze landed on something in the yard. Something in the grass, just a few feet from the front step. A note. I walked toward it, my legs shaking with each step. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, jagged, but legible. "I'm watching, and so are they. It's already too late." My heart skipped a beat. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned to my mom, who looked just as terrified as I felt. We didn't know what to do next. The police? Again? But what would they even say? They hadn't helped us last time. How could they? Before I could say anything, my phone buzzed again. It was another unknown number. I almost didn't want to answer it, but I had to. I needed to know who it was. I needed to know what was going on. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still watching," the voice on the other end said. But it wasn't distorted this time. It was clearer, stronger. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Where's my dad?" The voice chuckled darkly. "He's closer than you think, Parker. But you won't find him. Not unless you start listening." "Stop this!" I shouted into the phone, but the line went silent. I dropped the phone in horror. My body was numb, my heart racing. I turned toward the door and bolted inside, closing it behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. My mind was spinning. I couldn't make sense of anything. My dad was missing. The calls were getting worse. And the notes. Whoever or whatever was doing this wasn't going to stop. I ran upstairs, hoping to find some sort of answer, some kind of clue that could lead me to my dad. I checked every room in the house, searching through every drawer, every closet, but there was nothing, no sign of him anywhere. I finally went into my parents' bedroom, and that's when I saw it. A new note stuck to the mirror. "Your dad isn't coming back. You're next." I grabbed the note and ran downstairs, my chest tight with fear. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't process what was happening. All I could do was wait for the next call, wait for the next sign that would tell me what was happening to us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to stop. Not until they had all of us. The house felt colder now, even though the heater was running. I couldn't stop shaking. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty rooms, making my skin crawl. My mom was sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. The tears had stopped, replaced by a hollow look of defeat. I could see the fear in her eyes, the helplessness that mirrored my own. We were both trapped in a house that felt more like a prison with each passing second. The note in my hand was a cruel reminder that the game had already begun. "You're next," it read. My thoughts spiraled into dark corners, wondering if the voice on the phone meant my mom or me. What if it meant both of us? I set the note on the kitchen counter and turned toward the hallway. The silence was suffocating. My feet were heavy, each step like a slow march toward something worse. My mind kept flashing back to the phone calls. "He's gone. You didn't listen. It's too late." I tried to ignore the tightening in my chest. I needed to keep moving, to find answers, to bring my dad back if I could. There had to be something, a clue, a mistake. Maybe this was all a horrible misunderstanding. I grabbed the flashlight from the junk drawer, trying to shake off the dread building inside me. The darkness outside the windows seemed to press against the house, as if something was waiting out there, watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that the phone call wasn't just some random, twisted prank. It felt too personal. Whoever was behind this knew us. They knew me. They knew our routines, our vulnerabilities. I returned to the front door and looked out at the street, trying to convince myself that the silence was just the calm before the storm. The trees were still, their branches swaying with an unnatural slowness, like they were reaching toward me, just waiting for the right time to grab hold. The wind had picked up slightly, sending leaves scattering across the lawn, but there was something off about the way they moved, like they were being dragged by an invisible force. I stepped back inside and locked the door again, my fingers trembling. That's when I heard it. A knock. Not a light tap, but a heavy thudding at the door. The kind of knock that makes your bones vibrate. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. Who could it be? The police? No. I had just spoken with them, and they had no answers. Not to mention they were still too far away to have arrived in the short time I had been searching. I hesitated. The knock came again, louder this time, almost as if it was angry. My mom looked at me from the living room. Her face was drawn in fear, her eyes wide, pleading with me to not answer. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." But I couldn't stop myself. I was already moving toward the door, every part of my being screaming to turn away, to ignore it. But the curiosity, the need for answers, it was stronger. I couldn't breathe until I knew who or what was behind that door. I reached for the handle, my hand slick with sweat. As soon as I touched it, the knocking stopped. For a split second, the silence was even worse than the sound. I stood there, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. I could feel the darkness pressing against me, waiting. I opened the door slowly, just a crack, and peered outside. Nothing, but the air had changed. The temperature had dropped. It felt like the world was holding its breath. That's when I noticed it. On the doorstep, a small wooden box. I hadn't seen anyone leave it, and the shadows were too thick for anyone to have been standing there. There was no sound, no movement. I bent down and picked it up, feeling an odd warmth radiating from the box, despite the chill in the air. The box was simple, no markings or labels, just plain wood with brass hinges. I hesitated, but the compulsion to open it was too strong. Inside, there was nothing but a single piece of paper. I took it out and unfolded it carefully. "They're coming for you." I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs again. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. It looked just like the scrawl of the note from earlier. It was the same jagged edges, the same disturbing certainty. But this message wasn't like the others. It was a threat. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Something was behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My pulse was racing as I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I could hear my mom moving in the next room, whispering to herself, her voice filled with dread. I ran to the living room, clutching the note in my hand. "Mom, you need to see this," I said, but when I looked up, I froze. She was standing in the middle of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes wide, staring at the wall across from her. Her mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. And then I saw it too. On the wall, scratched into the paint, was another message. "You've been warned." It was in the same handwriting, but this time it was different. The letters were more deliberate, carved into the wall with what looked like a knife. The wood around the scratches was splintered and cracked, as though the message had been carved deep into the wall over time, waiting to be found. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room felt heavy, and there was a faint, metallic smell, like blood. Suddenly, the house groaned, a low, unsettling creak that seemed to come from deep within the foundation. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The house felt alive. The walls felt like they were closing in on us. I grabbed my mom by the arm and pulled her away from the wall. "We need to leave. Now," I urged, my voice tight with fear. But when I tried to lead her toward the door, my feet faltered. It was as if the house itself didn't want us to leave. The door was no longer in front of us. The living room was different. The layout had changed. The windows, once clear and bright, were now covered in a thick, black fog. The walls were too close, the corners too sharp. The room felt smaller, more suffocating. I turned back toward my mom, who looked just as confused and terrified as I felt. "This isn't possible," I said. "This isn't happening." But then the floor began to shake. The walls trembled, a low hum vibrating through the house. The lights flickered and buzzed, and for a split second, everything went completely dark. I heard footsteps, loud, heavy. They were coming toward us. And then a voice. Not the one from the phone. No, this voice was something else, something worse. It was guttural, like something trying to crawl out of the ground. "You didn't listen," it rasped. "Now you'll never escape." The room seemed to warp. The walls twisted. The shadows grew larger, darker. They reached out for us, crawling across the floor like liquid darkness. I grabbed my mom's hand, pulling her as we stumbled toward what should have been the door. But the house wouldn't let us go. The footsteps got closer. There was nowhere left to run. The lights flickered again, and in that moment, everything went silent. And then, a scream that wasn't mine, and it wasn't my mom's. It was my dad's. It echoed through the house like a siren, piercing through the thick air and rattling the walls. My body froze, my breath stuck in my throat. My mother's grip tightened on my arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. We were both trembling, paralyzed by the sound that no one should ever have to hear. The voice of someone we loved, twisted with terror and anguish. "Dad," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. It felt like an impossibility, but that scream, it was his. I knew it. Before we could react, the house seemed to shift again. The floor groaned beneath our feet, and a heavy thud echoed from above. The ceiling trembled as if something, or someone, was moving upstairs, dragging itself slowly, deliberately, toward us. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of impending doom, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But where? The house was no longer the one I knew. Every room felt like a labyrinth, an inescapable maze that twisted and turned, trapping us in this nightmare. I pulled my mom toward the stairs, desperate to get to the second floor, where the sound had come from. My legs felt like they were made of stone, each step heavy, as though the house itself was trying to keep us from moving forward. The stairs creaked underfoot, and I glanced back, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows below. When we reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway stretched out in front of us, shrouded in darkness, except for one faint glow coming from my father's study. The door was ajar, just a crack, as though something, had been there watching. I could feel the presence on the other side, thick and suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing against the door. The air was colder now, the silence more profound, like the house was holding its breath. My fingers were ice cold as I reached for the door, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, as if something heavy was blocking it from the other side. "Mom, help me," I muttered through clenched teeth. Together, we pushed with all our strength. The door creaked open just a little more, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape in the room. My heart stopped. It wasn't my father. It wasn't even human. The thing in the study was hunched over, its back arched at an unnatural angle. Its skin was a pale, sickly white, stretched thin across sharp bones, and its fingers were long, curled into claws. It had no eyes, only empty, hollow sockets that seemed to consume the darkness around it. Its mouth was a jagged, gaping hole, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth, and it was staring at us. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, sending a shiver down my spine. It slowly turned its head toward us, its mouth twitching as if it were savoring the fear. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. It was as if it could see into my very soul. "Run," my mom whispered, her voice trembling with panic. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring the moment. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing closer, as if the creature itself was absorbing the very light around us. Suddenly, the thing lunged forward with unnatural speed. I barely had time to react as its clawed hand shot out, grabbing my mother by the arm. She screamed, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the thick air. I tried to grab her, but the creature was too strong, its grip unyielding, as it dragged her toward the dark corner of the room. I wasn't sure what happened next. Panic surged through me, drowning out everything but the terror that had taken hold. I swung my flashlight, trying to strike the creature, but it was as though it was moving in slow motion, its body bending and contorting around my blows. My mom's screams echoed in my ears as she was pulled deeper into the shadows. Without thinking, I reached for the nearest object, my father's desk lamp, and swung it at the creature. It shattered on impact, but the thing didn't seem to feel it. It was as if it was made of something far worse than flesh. And then, there was a sound that chilled me to the core. A voice, low and raspy, as if it had been trapped in the creature's throat for centuries. "It's already too late." The words seemed to hang in the air like poison, twisting everything inside me. The creature's lips curled into a grotesque smile, and then it did something worse than I could have imagined. It spoke again. "You should never have come back." The walls of the house began to tremble, and I could hear the distant sound of a door opening. But it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the darkness. I turned toward the doorframe. There, standing in the entrance of the study, was my father. But something was wrong. His eyes were hollow, his skin ashen, and his movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. He stepped into the room slowly, his gaze locked on me, his lips curled into a twisted smile. "Dad." My voice was barely a whisper. My hands shook as I reached out for him. I wanted to run to him, to pull him into my arms, but something inside me screamed that it was too late. This wasn't my father. The thing that had once been him opened its mouth, revealing teeth that were sharper than any human's. It hissed as it spoke, its voice nothing like my father's. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, each word colder than the last. "Now you will join us." The air in the room grew even colder. The creature that had been holding my mother let go of her arm, and she fell to the floor, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with fear. The thing released a low, unsettling laugh before turning its attention to her. I couldn't think. I couldn't process the horror of what was happening. It was like my brain had short-circuited, unable to accept the reality of what I was seeing. But the thing that was my father didn't move toward her. Instead, it reached for me, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. I recoiled, pulling away from the touch, but the darkness around us thickened, closing in. Then the house shook, harder than before. The entire room trembled violently, and the lights flickered, plunging us into near total darkness. And that's when I heard it again, the scream. But this time, it wasn't just a scream. It was a wail, a horrible, tortured sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls seemed to stretch and contract, and I could feel something pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. The ground beneath me began to crack, as though the house itself was breaking apart. I glanced toward the doorway, where my father now stood completely still, his mouth agape, as if in a trance. The thing in the corner had stopped moving, watching me, waiting. There was no escape. There never had been. The shadows closed in around us, and I knew, without a doubt, that this house had become something more than just a home. It had become a prison, a place of torment where the past was bound to the present. The creatures that lurked in the corners of the room were not just manifestations of darkness. They were the souls of those who had been consumed by the house before us. They were the remnants of all who had walked these halls, cursed to remain forever. I reached for my mother's hand, my voice trembling as I whispered, "We have to leave. Now." But it was too late. The walls pressed in, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room became nothing but black. The darkness enveloped us, suffocating and oppressive, like a living, breathing thing. I could no longer hear my mother's breathing, only the eerie silence that seemed to press in on all sides. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat more desperate than the last. My throat felt tight, as though something was choking me from the inside. I reached out, groping for my mother in the suffocating blackness. My fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the desk, and I cursed under my breath. The shadows had thickened to such an extent that I could no longer see a thing. No light, no shape, no movement. I was blind, trapped in an endless void. But then there was a sound, a whisper, a rasping, bone-chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. It slid across my skin like icy fingers, and I froze. "You will never leave." The voice was a guttural hiss, its words dragging with them a terrible weight. My stomach twisted, and my hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as if something was standing just behind me, breathing in the same air. I tried to speak, to call out to my mother, but my voice failed me. It was as if the air around me had thickened, like it was refusing to let me escape. The floor beneath my feet shifted, groaning as though the very house was alive, shifting and moving, a living thing with its own pulse and breath. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I heard it again, the scream. But this time, it wasn't just a scream. It was a cacophony of voices, a chorus of pain and anguish, all mixed together in a single, horrifying wail. The air vibrated with it, and I felt my stomach lurch. I couldn't tell if the scream was from my mother or from the creature that had taken my father's place. Or was it something else? Something older, more ancient? The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could feel the cold wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I shivered uncontrollably, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was moving in the darkness, just beyond my reach, and I could hear the scrape of something heavy dragging across the floor. Then, the light flickered. It was so faint that I almost didn't notice it at first. But as the darkness pressed in around us, the tiny flicker of light grew. My eyes strained, desperate for any form of illumination. It was coming from the doorway, the thin crack of light spilling from the other side. Without thinking, I stumbled toward it, my feet scraping across the floor. Each step felt like I was wading through molasses, as though the house itself was holding me back. "Mom!" I cried out, my voice weak, but there was no response. I pushed the door open just a crack, and a wave of cold air rushed past me, nearly knocking me back. There, standing in the hallway, was him, the thing that had once been my father. But he wasn't just standing anymore. He was moving. His eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, black pits, and his skin hung in grotesque, flabby folds. His face was stretched into a monstrous grin, one that did not belong to the man I had once known. His hands twitched, long, skeletal fingers scraping across the wood of the doorway as he stepped closer. I recoiled in fear, but I couldn't move fast enough. He was already there. I backed away, stumbling over the carpet as he came closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. I could feel his presence pressing in on me, pushing me toward the edge of some invisible cliff. "You shouldn't have come back," the creature rasped, its voice a deep, guttural growl that scraped against my nerves. "The house is hungry, and it won't let you leave." I turned to my mother, but she wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room. Where was she? Where had she gone? And then I saw it. Her form was standing in the far corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. But she wasn't moving. She was frozen, a statue trapped in the house's grip. I ran to her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom!" I shouted, shaking her by the shoulders. But she didn't respond. Her body was stiff, her eyes glazed over in a state of horror that I couldn't understand. The creature's voice slithered through the room again, low and mocking. "You see, don't you? It's already too late. Too late." The word struck me like a blow to the chest. I had tried to fight. I had tried to escape. But in the end, the house had won. It had taken my father, twisted him into something monstrous. It had claimed us, and we were trapped in its web. And then, as if on cue, the room around us seemed to warp. The walls stretched, the floor beneath us buckling as though the entire house was breathing, expanding, and contracting. The air grew thick with the scent of rot, of decay. The light in the hallway dimmed, and the shadows began to swallow everything. I turned back toward the doorway, but the thing that had once been my father was already gone. In his place stood something worse, something that made the darkness itself seem alive. The air became heavy, suffocating. I tried to scream, but my voice was choked by the weight of the presence around me. My vision blurred, the edges of reality warping. The very fabric of the house seemed to be unraveling, and I realized with cold certainty that we weren't just trapped in a house. We were trapped in something much worse. The creature that had once been my father stood in front of me, its gaping mouth twisting in that horrible grin. And then, it spoke again, its voice echoing through the suffocating air. "Now you will join us." The darkness closed in, wrapping itself around me like chains. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The last thing I saw before the shadows took everything was my mother's face, frozen in fear, and the scream that followed, loud and desperate, echoing through the house. If you are currently enjoying this story, pause the video and please subscribe to the Horror Shack, and make sure you like this video and leave us a comment saying I am enjoying the story, as this would help us get feedback and also encourage us to tell more true spine-chilling stories like this one. Now let's continue the story. Story 2. The Children at the Playground by Ronan. Sometimes kids say things that don't make sense, but they're so confident about it that it stops you in your tracks. Like, you're driving or folding laundry, and out of nowhere they'll drop some random thought that makes you think, wait, what did you just say? That's how it started. It started like any regular Thursday. I had the day off, so I took my daughter, Lila, to the park. She's 4, full of energy and always talking. She loves being around other kids, climbing on everything, and of course the swings. If she had it her way, she'd probably stay at the park until the stars came out. That afternoon, though, we stayed a little later than usual. We'd gotten caught up playing tag with some other kids and their parents, and before I knew it, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting this golden glow over everything. The temperature was dropping, and most of the families had already packed up and left. I figured it was time to call it a day. We said goodbye to the last few kids still hanging around, and I strapped Lila in her car seat. She was humming this tune she'd been singing all day, something she made up about unicorns and rainbows. Honestly, I wasn't really paying attention. It was just background noise as I focused on getting us home. We were about 10 minutes into the drive when we passed by the old playground near the abandoned school. You know the type? Rusted swings, weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement, graffiti on the walls. I didn't think much of it. I mean, it's just a rundown playground, right? But that's when Lila stopped humming. At first, I thought she'd fallen asleep. It was quiet, too quiet. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was, wide awake, staring out the window. Her face had this weird expression, like she was trying to figure something out. "Everything okay, kiddo?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, and when she finally did, her voice was soft, almost like she was talking to herself. "Why are they out there, Daddy?" "Oh," I asked, glancing at the playground as we drove past. I didn't see anyone. The swings were still. The slide was empty. There wasn't a single person around. "The kids," she said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "They're on the swings." Now, here's the thing. I know what I saw, and it was nothing. Just an empty, broken playground in the middle of nowhere. But the way she said it, I don't know, it made my stomach drop. "What kids, Lila?" She leaned forward as much as her car seat would let her, her little hand pointing at the playground. "Right there, on the swings. They're looking at me." I slowed down the car, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. I don't know why, but something about the way she said it made me uneasy. I glanced at the playground again, but it was still empty. No kids, no people, just the rusted old swings hanging there, barely moving in the breeze. "Lila," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "there's no one there. Are you sure you're not imagining it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head like she was studying something really closely. Then, without looking at me, she said, "They're waving at me now." I swear my chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what do you say to that? I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to catch her eyes, but she was still looking out the window, her expression dead serious. "They're just playing," she added, almost as if she was reassuring herself. I didn't want to scare her, but something about this whole thing felt off. I pressed the gas pedal just a little harder, putting more distance between us and the playground. "Maybe you were just dreaming, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound casual. "You've been playing so much today. Maybe your brain's just tired." She finally looked at me through the mirror, her brows furrowed. "I wasn't dreaming. They're there. They're wearing funny clothes." Funny clothes. What did she mean by that? I almost didn't want to ask, but I couldn't help myself. "What kind of clothes?" "Old clothes," she said, like it was obvious. "Like from a long time ago. They look like Halloween costumes." I didn't say anything after that. I mean, what was I supposed to say? I told myself it was just her imagination. Kids see things, right? They make up stories. They say weird stuff without thinking. That's all it was. At least, that's what I told myself. The rest of the drive was quiet. Lila went back to humming, but her song sounded softer, more distracted. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following us, but the road behind us stayed empty. When we got home, everything felt normal again. Lila ran inside, still singing her little tune, and I locked up the car. By the time I made it to the living room, she was already curled up on the couch with her favorite stuffed animal, watching one of those kids' shows where everything is bright and happy and nothing bad ever happens. I sat down beside her and tried to shake off the weird feeling from earlier. It was just a playground, an empty playground. Kids have overactive imaginations. That's all it was. But then, out of nowhere, Lila turned to me and said, "Daddy, you know they weren't really kids, right?" I froze. "What do you mean, Lila?" She shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. "They were just pretending." My mouth went dry. "Pretending to be kids?" She nodded, her eyes still glued to the TV. "Yeah, they looked like kids, but they weren't. They told me. I don't know what came over me, but I felt this cold wave wash over me." "What do you mean they told you? When?" She looked at me like I was the one being weird. "When we drove past. The one in the red dress said, 'We're not really kids.'" She waved at me. I felt like someone had just poured ice water down my spine. I tried to keep my face neutral. I didn't want to scare her, but my hands were clenching the armrest of the couch so hard my knuckles turned white. "Lila," I said slowly, "did you talk to them? Like, did they say anything else to you?" She tilted her head, as if she was trying to remember something. Then she said, "No, just that they weren't kids. But they smiled a lot. The boy in the hat had big teeth." "Big teeth? What did that even mean?" My stomach churned as I forced a smile and said, "You know, sometimes when we're really tired, we see things that aren't there. Maybe that's all it was. Just your imagination." She giggled at that. "No, Daddy, I'm not imagining it. They were real. I saw them, and they saw me." I didn't know what to say to that. It was getting harder and harder to brush this off as some kind of childish fantasy. She was so calm about it, like this was just another normal day for her. Meanwhile, my mind was racing a mile a minute. I stood up, trying to act casual. "Why don't you finish your show, sweetheart? Daddy's going to get something to drink." In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter and tried to collect my thoughts. My hands were shaking as I poured myself a glass of water. Was she really just making this up? Or was there something else going on? I grabbed my phone and searched for anything I could find about that playground. Local history, ghost stories, urban legends, anything. But all I got were old articles about the school that used to be there. It had been abandoned for years, but there was nothing out of the ordinary in the search results. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, after putting Lila to bed, I stayed up late. I kept telling myself it was just to catch up on work, but the truth was, I didn't want to go to sleep. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a soft creaking noise, like an old door swinging in the wind. But it didn't stop. It came in slow, rhythmic intervals. Creak, pause, creak. I got up and looked out the window. My stomach dropped. The playground was across the street from our house, and one of the swings was moving. Back and forth. Back and forth. There was no wind. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was tired. I was stressed. And I was letting a 4-year-old's words get to me. But then I heard it again, laughter. Quiet, high-pitched giggles like a group of kids whispering secrets. I stared at the playground, my breath fogging up the window. There was no one there, just the swing, creaking like it had a mind of its own. Daddy, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around to see Lila standing in the hallway, rubbing her eyes. Her hair was messy, and she was clutching her stuffed animal. Lila, what are you doing up? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They're here, she said matter-of-factly. My blood ran cold. Who's here, sweetheart? She pointed toward the window. The kids. They came to play. I turned back to the window, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. But the playground was empty. Lila, I said carefully, you need to go back to bed. It's late, but they're waiting for me, she insisted. They want me to come outside. I crouched down in front of her, my hands on her shoulders. Listen to me, Lila. You're not going anywhere. Okay. You need to stay inside. It's not safe out there at night. She frowned, like she didn't understand why I was so upset. But they're nice. They just want to play. I didn't know how to respond. How do you reason with a 4-year-old who's talking about invisible children? Let's go back to bed, I said finally. I led Lila back to her room, trying to keep my footsteps light and my breathing steady. She clutched my hand the entire way, her little fingers warm and innocent, while mine were clammy with nerves. Once we reached her bed, she climbed in without protest, pulling her blanket up to her chin. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Daddy," she replied, her voice soft. But just as I was about to turn off the light, she added, "Don't worry. They'll come back tomorrow." I froze. "What did you say?" She blinked up at me, looking confused. "The kids. They said they'll come back tomorrow. They said we can all play together then." For a second, I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Let's talk about it in the morning, okay? Get some sleep." She nodded and rolled onto her side, hugging her stuffed animal close. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Once I was in the hallway, I closed her door just enough to leave a sliver of light from the hallway shining in. Then I leaned against the wall and tried to catch my breath. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself with TV, but every little noise, the creak of the floorboards, the rustling of the wind outside, made me jump. At some point, I must have dozed off on the couch because I woke up to the sound of Lila's laughter. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up straight, my heart racing. The room was still dark, and the clock on the wall read 3:12 a.m. The laughter came again, light and bubbly, but it wasn't coming from Lila's room. It was coming from outside. I stood up and walked to the window, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I peeked through the curtain, and there they were. The swings were moving again, but this time, they weren't empty. 3 children sat on them, their legs kicking in unison as they swung back and forth. Their faces were pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and their clothes looked old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photograph. One of them, a little girl with braids, stopped swinging and turned to look directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I grabbed my phone and called 911. When the operator answered, I tried to explain what I was seeing without sounding like a complete lunatic. "There are kids outside at the playground," I stammered. "It's the middle of the night. They shouldn't be there." The woman on the other end sounded calm, almost bored. "Sir, are the children in danger?" I don't know," I admitted, "but they shouldn't be there. Can you just send someone to check it out?" "We'll dispatch an officer to your location," she said. I hung up and paced the living room, glancing at the window every few seconds. The swings were still moving, but now the children were standing around the merry-go-round, holding hands like they were playing some kind of game. I kept telling myself the police would be here soon. They'd see the kids and take them home. Everything would be fine. But when the patrol car finally pulled up, the playground was empty. The officer got out and shone his flashlight around, checking the swings, the slides, and the jungle gym. He even walked around the perimeter of the park, his light cutting through the bushes and casting long shadows on the ground. When he came to my door, I opened it before he could knock. "Did you find them?" I asked, my voice shaking. He shook his head. "There's no one out there, sir." "Are you sure you saw something?" I wanted to scream. Of course I was sure. I wasn't hallucinating. But the look on his face told me he thought I was either drunk, high, or crazy. "I saw them," I insisted. 3 kids. They were swinging and playing." He sighed and put his notebook away. "If you see anything else, give us a call. But right now, there's nothing out there." I nodded numbly and watched as he got back into his car and drove off. The next morning, Lila acted like nothing had happened. She ate her cereal, watched cartoons, and chattered about her favorite characters as if the night before had been a bad dream. But when I asked her about the kids, she smiled and said, "They're my friends now. They told me they'll be back tonight." That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay in this house another night. By mid-morning, I had made up my mind to leave the house, at least temporarily. Something about the playground, about those kids, made my stomach churn with unease. Lila seemed unfazed, humming softly as she played with her dolls, but her carefree demeanor only added to my anxiety. I decided not to tell her we were leaving. The last thing I wanted was to make her think anything was wrong. "Hey, sweetheart," I said casually, crouching down beside her. "How about we go visit Grandma today? We can stay the night if you want." Her face lit up. "Can I bring my toys?" "Of course," I replied, trying to mask the urgency in my voice. Within the hour, I had packed a bag for both of us and loaded everything into the car. Lila seemed excited about the impromptu trip, chatting about how she'd show Grandma her new coloring book. As I backed out of the driveway, I avoided looking at the playground. But Lila didn't. "They're waving goodbye," she said cheerfully. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes on the road. We arrived at my mom's house a little after noon. She lived about 45 minutes away in a quiet neighborhood that felt like a different world compared to the eerie isolation of my place. Mom was thrilled to see us, and Lila ran straight to her arms. For the first time in what felt like days, I allowed myself to relax. Over dinner, I avoided mentioning the real reason for our visit. I didn't want to worry my mom, and truthfully, I wasn't sure how to explain what was happening without sounding insane. That night, I put Lila to bed in the guest room and stayed up late talking with Mom. She could tell something was bothering me, but I brushed it off, blaming work stress and sleepless nights. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. The sound of laughter woke me up. It wasn't loud, more like a faint giggling, but it was enough to make my heart race. For a moment, I thought I was still at home. Then I remembered. We were at Mom's house. I sat up in bed listening. The giggles were coming from outside. No! I got up and peeked through the window. My mom's backyard was small, bordered by a tall wooden fence. There shouldn't have been anyone back there. But there they were. 3 shadowy figures, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, were playing near the garden swing set. My breath caught in my throat. It was them, the same kids from the playground. One of them, the girl with braids, turned her head slowly and looked directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. My first instinct was to check on Lila. I burst into the guest room and found her sitting up in bed, clutching her stuffed animal. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't look scared, just curious. "Daddy," she whispered. "They followed us." The rest of the night was a blur. I sat in the corner of the guest room, Lila curled up next to me, while I clutched my phone, ready to call for help if I needed to. But the kids didn't try to come inside. They just stayed in the backyard, playing. By morning, they were gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my mom at work and explained everything, or at least the parts one could without sounding completely unhinged. She suggested I talk to a local historian or even a priest. I didn't know if I believed in ghosts or spirits, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. Later that day, I visited the local library and spoke to an older librarian who had lived in the town for decades. When I mentioned the playground near my house, her face grew serious. "That playground," she said slowly, "used to belong to an orphanage. It burned down in the 1950s. A lot of children didn't make it out." My blood ran cold. She continued, "People say the spirits of those children linger there. Some folks claim they've seen them, but they're harmless. Just lost." I wanted to believe they were harmless, but the way Lila spoke about them, the way they had followed us, made me think otherwise. That night, back at Mom's house, I decided to confront them. I couldn't keep running, and I needed to protect my daughter. Around midnight, the giggles started again. This time, I didn't look out the window. I went straight to the backyard, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a racing heart. The air was cold, and the night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. The swing set stood empty, but I could feel them. "Why are you following us?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, a soft voice, childlike and distant, whispered, "We're lonely." My flashlight flickered and I froze. "Go away," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You can't have her. Leave us alone." The swing set creaked, and the giggling stopped. When I turned to go back inside, I felt a cold hand brush against mine. The next morning, I made arrangements to sell the house. I don't know if the children ever truly left or if they found someone else to play with, but I never took Lila back to that neighborhood. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear faint giggles when the wind blows just right. And every so often, Lila will mention her friends. "They still visit me in my dreams, Daddy," she said once. I didn't have the heart to ask her what they wanted. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.